What a fantastic room. I'm actually here just to kind of introduce what we have going on this afternoon. But before we actually introduce our plenary speaker, I'm going to introduce you Ryan Castle. He's the president of our board of directors for a few words.
Thank you, Jacob. And as they'll get recognized throughout the day, but another round of applause for the Summit Planning Committee, Jacob and Craig and all the other people on the Summit Planning Committee. They do such a phenomenal job planning this. Thank you guys again for such a great day so far. And as always, if you like what you see today and you want to be a part next year, talk to Lauren, talk to Megan, talk to Craig, and we can get you on board for next year for planning the summit. It's a lot of work, but we always need volunteers to help out. So with that, welcome. As the president of the CCYP, I have the honor to welcome you guys to the middle of the day session, the lunch. Hope you're enjoying it. Seacrest is doing a phenomenal job, and I hope you enjoy the facility. I want to talk a few minutes about CCYP and what we do and where we're going. As most of you guys know, we embed in everything we do what our mission is, which is to connect, engage, and advance Cape Cod's next generation of leaders and workforce for those under 45. And that doesn't mean that it's just for those under 45. What it means is that's who we're focused on, right? And anyone who is any ages who wants to help us focus on that part of the Cape and that sector, come help us out. That's what we love. And that's what we're doing. And you're going to see a great surprise at the end of the day of a new program we're rolling out that I hope you'll stay to the end of the day to see as Lauren talks about that. So really where we're looking at doing is following our needs assessment that we did last year. And what it showed is what this community needs to continue our growth and continue the potential, which is areas of connections, trying to figure out how to make more meaningful connections among our community. And that's what today's about. That's what our After Connect events are about. And that's what anything CCYP does, is how to create those meaningful connections, those lifelong friendships. There are so many people in the room that I know that say their best friends were made at CCYP events. And so that's, if we can continue to do that, we continue to strengthen that bond to Cape Cod. Advancing, that's what today's about, professional development, growing that professional development and other things with our partnership for E4All. Kristen Marshall's here. If you haven't met her, she had a session today about what E4All is doing and some of those companies coming out of that are going to be great companies and long-term for Cape Cod's economy. So take a look at that stuff. And then also the engaging part, the mock town meeting we have this afternoon, the housing advocacy session we had this morning. Our needs assessment showed that housing and childcare are the two primary drivers of unaffordability on the Cape. And so we're working hard in those two areas going forward to try to promote solutions to both of those issues. So thank you guys for today. And we'll be around. Talk to anyone that's on the board of directors. The board of directors is here. If you're on the board, stand up real quick so anyone can see you and talk to you more about what CCYP is doing. Thank you guys very much for your time and efforts. And I'm turning back over to Jacob. Oh, no, sorry. My bad. I had one other goal to do. Sorry. Also to introduce our sponsor for today, your lunch, your whole day sponsor. If we get a few words from Kareem at Cape Cod 5.
Good afternoon, everyone. As some of you might know, I play the drums. And when I first started playing many years ago, my mentor used to always tell me that the drummer is supposed to stay in the back and keep quiet because no one wants to hear the drummer talk. So here I am. I'm here today in a different role as mortgage loan officer with the Cape Cod 5. And I'd like to give a big thanks to Lauren and Ryan and Megan, the staff and the board of directors at the CCYP, as well as everyone that's worked on this event, Craig, Sarah, and the entire committee. The bank is pleased to be a sponsor for the 4th annual Shape the Cape Summit, and the bank really values our long-standing relationship with the CCYP. And a little bit about myself, I grew up on the Cape. I was born and raised. went to Nauset High School, Cape Cod Community College, which I think is one of the finest organizations around. And I transferred to Boston College and then came back and started my career in banking. And growing up on the Cape, one of the common themes was that young people don't live here. Cape Cod's a great place to grow up, and you go off to college, you have a family, you have a career, and then you retire here one day. And the common theme was that we don't have any young people down here. And I think looking around the room today, we can see that things are changing and have changed, and I think that's wonderful. I think one of the strong points of this organization is that we talk so much about we hear about issues on the Cape, for instance, the housing issue, and we talk about it and we see it in the newspaper, and they do studies, and the studies come back and say that we have an issue with housing. And I think this group, which really started to connect young people and show that there's other young people down here, has really blossomed and grown into a group that can make changes, positive changes, and can affect where we live. And I think I attended a session with Hack. It was the morning session, and they covered everything so beautifully. But there was a gentleman there, and I didn't catch his name. He was a planner for the town of Provincetown, and he really spoke about how we can make an impact by getting out there and voting and really getting involved and going to town meetings. And I just think that this organization and the people involved can really take the next step to not just talk about things, but make changes for the better. And also another thing, I think, is that this group can really embrace change. And when I grew up on the Cape, everyone always said they wanted the Cape to stay the same. They didn't want it to change. Well, sure, we want to preserve the natural beauty of the Cape, but we need to embrace change. Things change. You know, as Bert Tollerman says of the Cape Cod Five, we don't live in a museum. Demographics change, population change, technology, climate, and these are all things that we really need to embrace. And I think that's one of another strength of this organization, is that we can really embrace change and better the Cape for ourselves and our friends, our family, our coworkers, and for generations to come. And I think that this summit is a catalyst for community action and is a real hub of opportunity for the Cape's workforce community. And myself and the bank, we really feel that today we can start on the right path to achieve that full potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. So CCYP is pleased to present Heidi Sosik. She is a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, or as we call it locally, WHOI, as our featured plenary speaker for the 2019 Shape Your Cape Summit. The plenary is a new feature of this year's summit, and we cannot be more thrilled to welcome Heidi as our inaugural speaker in this role. As a biologist, oceanographer, and inventor, Heidi and her coworkers have developed technologies to help scientists study microscopic organisms and previously unreachable parts of the ocean. But these technologies have also been adapted for use beyond the research lab or classroom. They're used to clean our water and improve environmental health, creating jobs and other tangible economic benefits in the process. Heidi has been on the faculty and staff of WHOI since 1994 and currently holds the Stanley W. Watson Chair for Excellence in Oceanography. She also serves as a lead investigator for WHOI's exploration of the ocean's twilight zone, a multi-year project that was recently awarded a $35 million grant, the largest in the organization's history. Heidi has given TED Talks about her work and these groundbreaking technologies and efforts to uncover the secrets of the ocean. We are honored to have her here with us today. Please welcome Heidi Sosik.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying this the meeting and having a great day. As you've just heard, I am a scientist. I've actually lived and worked on Cape Cod for over 25 years. And in that time, I've spent a lot of it thinking about these organisms or organisms like these. And I wonder how many of you have an idea what they might be. Just a vague idea. Put your hand up if you have a, they're not elephants, right? Not too many hands, there must be a few more. Okay, I see a few. Anybody want to call something out? Plankton, yeah, great, okay. So these are single-celled plankton that live everywhere in the ocean where sunlight filters down into the water. They're so small that you need a microscope to see them. In fact, the smallest, if you put 50 of them side by side as close as you could, they still wouldn't reach from one side to the other of the width of an average human hair. As you can see from looking at them, they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. They play incredibly important roles in ocean food webs, and they even do things like help to regulate the climate of our whole planet. So scientists like me, we have kind of a bad reputation for going on and on and on about things that fascinate us, but maybe not so much everyone around us. And trust me, in the time I have, I could go on and on about these organisms, but I'm going to try to do something a little bit different and weave in some aspects of my life, my work here, and why it turns out that Cape Cod is such an amazing place for someone like me who's fascinated by tiny life in the ocean. I will still tell you some interesting, cool things about these organisms, so stay tuned for that. All right. Okay, so I guess, I was just going to say you could see that. So you saw that for a few minutes. That was an aerial view of Woods Hole, where my laboratory is located. If you have taken the Martha's Vineyard ferry from Woods Hole, chances are you've walked by the laboratory where I work at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And you probably had no idea that you were passing through the campus of what is the world's leading nonprofit organization that's focused solely on exploration, understanding, and education about the ocean. Okay, let's see what happens now. All right, there is that aerial view I was just talking about. And this incredible world-renowned institution is located right in the midst of this beautiful seaside village. The Oceanographic Institution has been here since the 1930s. It now has hundreds of scientists and engineers who are passionate about studying and learning about the ocean. There are about 1,000 employees total at the institution, over a $200 million annual operating budget, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of research projects ongoing at any one time. And the institution also operates things like large ocean-going research vessels that can work in any part of the global ocean. And we have an education program. We grant PhDs, so we're working to train the next generation of ocean scientists and engineers. So for someone like me, working at a place like this, it sounds like a dream come true. But I want to convey to you that idea of having a dream and it turning into a reality for me is way too simple. It was actually quite a serendipitous path that led me to be standing in front of you today. And I'm also, every time I hear a super kind and generous introduction like the one that was made for me today, I think, who even is that like intimidating person, right? That's not me. And so here's the embarrassing part. This is me. I wanted to share this with you to give you a sense of what I mean by this, this feeling. This is me when I had no idea about a place like Woods Hole and even about being a scientist when I grew up. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, off Cape in central Mass. And I know it's hard to see this clipping. I don't even want to tell you how long my mom kept this little scrap of newspaper. But if you could see it better, it's me sitting amongst vines with leaves like this big around next to a huge squash. and I'll read you the caption. It says, squashed. Petite Heidi Sosik of Sturbridge will be eating squash for a long time. An amazing blue Hubbard squash, which grew from a single seed in a horse manure pile, has spread over 40 feet of ground on the Sosik's property. The squash themselves are the size of pumpkins and weigh from 30 to 45 pounds. Probably about as much as I weighed at that point. So I'm showing you this for a few reasons. First, at my roots, I'm a small town girl for sure. So this makes it immediately clear, right? We live in a place where something like this is a photo spot in the local newspaper. and I just have to say that I love living now in a Cape Cod town where, you know, something like this might show up in the Falmouth Enterprise. And in fact, my own 3 kids that I've raised here have appeared in the local newspaper. And that is really important to me, and it's amazing to be able to live in a place like that alongside having this sort of career that I do at the Oceanographic. Also, I want to just assure you that this little girl had no idea about being a scientist in Woods Hole, and just about the only thing that this carried forward is my fascination with homegrown food. I've actually here in Falmouth taken over pretty much my entire yard with raised beds growing vegetables. So some things carried forward, but not a dream from that time as a child. So that's enough about me for a minute. Let's go back to these really much more interesting plankton. So does anybody recognize this equation? So don't get anxious, just like channel high school science and maybe something else. Photosynthesis, perfect, thank you so much. I hope some of you had that like trickling up. All right, that is so awesome. Okay, so these tiny organisms are photosynthetic. They're able to take carbon dioxide or CO2 and water from the environment. Sunlight shines on them, they absorb the energy from the sunlight, and poof, like magic, they produce sugar and they release oxygen. This is exactly the same kind of photosynthesis that squash plant was doing to make the big leaves and to make the squash really sweet. These organisms are doing this in the ocean. They're just microscopic. And they have the same importance in the ocean as land plants do to us for our food chain, right? Everything we eat depends on photosynthesis in one way or another. If we eat seafood, we're depending on photosynthesis by these tiny organisms that feed the rest of the food chain. So I wasn't exaggerating when I said they're super important. So how do we study them? They're microscopic, so you can imagine we use microscopes, and we definitely do that, we still do. But microscopes are a really frustrating way to study the ocean. One person can look at a small amount of water, it's very time consuming, and the ocean is huge and all kinds of things are going on in it. So this kind of approach, as I said, it's really frustrating. So now let's fast forward to when I was in college, and I learned about what at the time was a relatively new method called flow cytometry. This is a laser-based approach to measure microscopic particles. They go through a high-powered laser and you can count them and measure their size. This actually occurred for me at the first time that I experienced Woods Hole. I was able to visit here during my undergraduate time in college, and it turned out to be quite life-changing. As you might have gathered from the picture of me on the horse manure pile, I came from a pretty modest background, and it wasn't easy for my family to send me to college. I had 3 siblings coming behind me, so I had in my mind I needed to go to college and be ready to get a job when I graduated. So I was studying engineering. I loved the engineering I was studying, and it seemed like a good path forward. And then I came to Woods Hole for the summer, and I got exposed to technologies like this and using them to measure these tiny organisms in the ocean. And that was pretty interesting. I was ready to leave the summer, go back to my classes, when the group I had been working with invited me to go on a research expedition to help them do some measurements at sea. And at first I wasn't too sure. They were asking me to volunteer. It was going to be a lot of hard work, and I was actually going to miss some classes because the semester would be starting. But then I thought, when am I going to have a chance to do something like this again in my life? And I agreed to go. We went on a research vessel across the North Atlantic from Woods Hole to the northern coast of Africa. And we brought along literally this flow cytometer. It filled like half a room on the ship. And we were using it to measure plankton. And I thought this was just going to be a life experience, and then I would go back to school. But in fact, this was a total life-changing experience for me. I discovered how incredibly fascinating the ocean is and what it's like to work at sea and take new technologies out into the ocean and learn things that no one else knew about life in the ocean. And I was totally captivated. It was just life-changing for me. I went back to school. I finished my engineering degrees. But then I decided to go on to get a graduate education and study ocean science. So I lived in Southern California for about 5.5 years while I was pursuing my PhD. I started my family there, and then I finished my degree, and I absolutely jumped at the opportunity to come back to Woods Hole for some postdoctoral studies. I thought I was coming for an 18-month fellowship appointment, and here I am 25 plus years later, so you can tell that I never left. An important thing that happened to me in those early days of coming back to Woods Hole after being here as an undergrad is that I embarked on a collaboration with this man, Rob Olson, who turned out to be a long-term mentor and colleague of mine, an excellent partner. We worked together for over 20 years. He's now retired. Rob and I were both fascinated by these tiny organisms that photosynthesize in the ocean, and we thought flow cytometry and using lasers to measure them was like the coolest thing since sliced bread. But we were still frustrated because we couldn't get to sea very often, once or twice a year, because getting out on a ship is really expensive. And we had to work like crazy getting the samples from the ocean, bringing them to the instrument. We could only measure so many samples even when we had a chance to be at sea with the instrument. So we started imagining ways that we might measure things in the ocean differently and get more information. And being at an incredible place like the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution meant that over a few years, we could go from those crazy imaginings to reality. And we were able to develop automated, essentially robotic sensors that do flow cytometry and microscopy underwater in the ocean. And trust me when I say we didn't know what we were doing. We were not instrument developers. Neither of us was trained in this. But we knew how to tinker with the measurements that as scientists we were making in the lab. And then at this incredible institution, we could go across the street and talk to an electrical engineer who would design and build the circuit board that we needed to run the instrument. Then we go down a few offices and talk to the mechanical engineer who knew just how to build the right kind of housing to put the instrument in so that it could go down into the ocean and work under pressure and not, flood with seawater or something terrible like that. So this place with all of this mix of expertise and knowledge in one spot was incredible and allowed us to invent these flow cytometers and microscopes that now work by themselves underwater. And we've been able to use these robotic underwater instruments measuring plankton at places like this ocean observatory. Sorry, it's cut off a little bit there, off the island of Martha's Vineyard. If any of you have been to South Beach on Martha's Vineyard on a clear day, you can see this observatory tower from the beach. We've been deploying our instruments there for many years, and this is helping us learn new things about how particular species of these tiny organisms are coming and going in the system and affecting the ecosystem. So this is just an example of 2 species we've been measuring for decades with these approaches, and we can now measure many different species so we can see the difference between, I guess it's almost the analog on land is the difference between a field of grass or corn versus a climax forest. These same kinds of changes in species and ecosystem structure are happening in the ocean, and now we have this incredible window into them with these new technologies. And I just remind you that this kind of observation, we're measuring every hour automatically with these instruments. There's no way you could do this as a person, getting a sample and looking through a microscope. So it's really been kind of game-changing. You might notice one thing, these 2 species I'm showing you, sometimes they go up and down really fast, right? They can, over the course of a few days or weeks, they can change the amount that's in the environment by 10, 100, 1,000 times. Any idea how they go from just being a few to a whole bunch? You start with a single cell. What happens? They get eaten, that's when they go away. How do you get more of them? They divide, exactly. So they're single cells. They get bigger when they photosynthesize, they reproduce their genetic material, and then they literally divide in two, they separate, and you have two. So one of the really amazing things about these microbes in the ocean is that they've adapted to the conditions, and they can do this really fast. Here's some examples of other species that we've imaged doing this division process. They can divide, some of them every day, even faster than once a day. So you imagine you have a little drop of seawater with one cell in it, and then the next day you have 2, and then 4, and then 8, and 16. So in a matter of a few days, you can go from 1 to 10, 100, 1,000 times more than you had earlier. And then, of course, as someone mentioned, the reason the ocean's not full of them is because something's eating them, and that starts the food chain, and that's how we support everything from fish to birds to whales. It starts with these tiny cells. I mentioned that these are really important organisms for the base of the food web, and they grow fast and help support marine ecosystems. Sometimes the fast-growing species, these are examples of some of them, have other effects on the ecosystem. These are species that can actually produce toxins at times under different growth conditions. And then when the animals like mussels or oysters, who filter plankton out of the water for food, when they eat them, they can accumulate those toxins, and then people in turn eat the shellfish and can get sick from the toxins. You may have heard of harmful algal blooms, or sometimes they're called red tides. It turns out that this underwater imaging technology that we developed to do basic research to understand ocean ecosystems is a really good tool for being able to look for the particular species that might be causing some of these toxic blooms. This is an example where we used one of these underwater microscopes off the coast of Texas to detect this particular species that was increasing in abundance. Turned out it was actually producing toxin, contaminating oysters, which had to be recalled from the market, and this kept people from getting sick. So this turned out to be a really incredible trajectory in my research experience that was nothing I could have predicted when I first came to the Cape and started this work. I was focusing on interesting questions to me about tiny life in the ocean and developed tools to help me answer those questions. Now it turns out these same tools can be used to help make sure that our food is safe, and that when we consume things like mussels and oysters, we're not liable to end up in the hospital. I want to say one more thing, important thing about doing this kind of work on Cape Cod and why this turns out to be such an amazing place. On the Cape, and actually in southeastern Massachusetts in general, there are dozens of small to medium-sized marine tech companies. And these are often helping to transition from research tools into commercial products. Here we have been able, with the original prototype of the underwater microscope that we developed, to move to an optimized design and ultimately a commercial design that we've worked on in partnership with a local company, McLean Research Incorporated, that's right here in Falmouth. In fact, the head of the company is here at this event today. And this has been a really incredible partnership for us, being able to take this technology that we developed and now have it be available for researchers and resource managers around the world. So all the plankton images that I showed you today, like these, were taken with these underwater robots. And now with the commercial partnership, we have a growing user base of these instruments around the world. And I estimate there's about 2 billion of these types of images that have been collected, and they're continuing to be collected even as I speak to you right now, and this is going on worldwide. So this kind of technology advance that has happened right here on the Cape is really changing our ability to get an amazing view into what would otherwise be a really invisible part of our planet. So you've heard just a tiny personal slice from me today about my experiences, but the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is made up of many researchers doing amazing things. And if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit our website. You can click the Join Us link and learn more about what's going on and ways that you can get involved. We really do want to be, in the ways that I talked about today, part of a larger community. In addition to following online, there are all kinds of ongoing activities that are open to the public lectures, tours, things like these special events where there are Woods Hole Days of Science, where you have interactive opportunities. You can meet scientists and engineers. You can also visit the exhibit center. It's open for school groups and the general public. This happens to be my mom and some of her friends. So I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in learning more. And I know that my time is up, so in a moment I think a video is going to come up that I'm going to leave you with, which is a view of the globe from satellites orbiting the Earth, looking down and measuring properties of the planet. It'll come up in a minute. It's just a little slow on the computer. And what you'll see, this is the global photosynthetic biosphere, real measurements from space. And if you don't remember anything else from what I talked about today, I want you to think about this picture. On land, what you're seeing is something called the vegetation index. So you see the green places are where there's like croplands and forests, and you can see deserts, right? Places where there's not a lot of vegetation. But look at the ocean. In the ocean, this map is showing chlorophyll concentration. Chlorophyll is the green pigment in those tiny cells that allows them to capture the sunlight's energy. And don't forget, even though when we look out the window, what we see are plants on land, the ocean is just as vital and just as important as a part of our life system on this planet. And those tiny cells are causing these incredibly dynamic patterns of ecosystem change that you can see all the way from outer space. The ocean is amazing, and these microbes are making it so. Thank you. If there's time, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Are we doing questions? Yep.
There
Okay.
was one. You must have questions. I won't step down until somebody asks me one.
That was gonna be good.
So this is something personally that I've had on my mind since we've really started this debate across the Cape and the islands, is the integration between technology and research, and very much of what you're talking about, private entities coming in to fund research for more dynamic approaches. The Cape and the islands has been increasingly having visitors in the ocean and coming to the beaches locally, and it has become a part of our debate as a community, and that's our friends, the great white sharks. And there's
I thought you were
unfortunately...
talking about tourists.
Nah, we can't do anything about them. Technology won't help until the bridges. But anyways, so the piece there is, unfortunately, the dialogue at times seems as though we're taking a piece out of town meeting from the movie Jaws, is killing sharks and putting up nets. And when we're talking about innovation and technology and one of the most foremost scientific research communities for the ocean being here on Cape Cod, do you feel that there's opportunities to be had there? So some of your personal thoughts.
Okay, so are you asking me if I think there's a technology solution to avoiding shark attacks?
Potentially. Or if there's a way
you
that
know,
there's innovation and funded research that could come to Hui to talk about that and take on that issue.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not aware of specific research that's directed towards that right now, but there are certainly researchers at Hui, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, as you mentioned, we often affectionately call it Hui. There are researchers there who are studying the biology of great white sharks. One of the methods that they use is to tag the sharks, so they know where they are. They can see how they're behaving in the natural environment. If tags were easy and cheap enough, I guess you could tag sharks that are lurking around the beaches, know when they're there, know when to swim somewhere else. We already do things where we have, for instance, another important large marine animal in our region are the North Atlantic right whales, which are a highly endangered species. There's a network that scientists and engineers at the Oceanographic have helped to design and implement to listen for the sounds of the whales and to help direct ship track. One of the major sources of mortality in this endangered species is ship strikes. And so there's a network that's been installed to listen for the sounds of the whales, to know when they're nearby, and then to direct pilots that are bringing ships through the channels when they need to slow down or follow a different route. I mean, in principle, I think you could think of something like that extended to an application where you wanted to avoid negative interactions between humans and sharks. But I'm talking out of turn, and next year you can bring an expert on sharks and talk about it.
I got a question for you.
Yes.
Yeah, so very nice presentation. And my question is, I'm glad I'm talking to a scientist with this. So how is climate change going to be affecting the work that you do going forward?
Yeah, great question. I love that one. So I went really fast past those couple of time series I showed you where for more than 15 years we've been measuring off Martha's Vineyard these tiny plankton in the ocean and looking at details of how they're changing. And one of the reasons that we've been doing that for so long, I'm pretty stubborn. Once I start measuring, I keep at it. It's not easy, but these long time series are really important for us to understand how the system is changing in response to things like climate variables. I had a graduate student that worked with me several years ago who showed that one of the species I showed you the time series for today has started what we call blooming. Its seasonal increase is happening earlier and earlier each year because the ocean is beginning to warm earlier in the season. Just like we might see earlier spring on land, we're seeing earlier spring in the ocean, and it's changing the communities at the base of the food web. I'm leading a big new project that was just started a couple of years ago. It's funded by the National Science Foundation that's focused on what we call long-term ecological research, where we'll now be looking at how those kind of changes are propagating up through the food web, how they are affecting the things that eat the phytoplankton, these photosynthetic plankton, and how that in turn moves up to have impacts on things like commercial fish, marine mammals, and birds. So really important questions, and there's no doubt the ocean around here is changing very fast, faster than other parts of the globe, in fact, and it's having impacts on the ecosystem already. And we need research for many reasons to understand that and to plan for the impacts that we'll have throughout the food web, including things like commercially important fish that we like to eat.
Right. So my tiny bit of understanding is that plankton likes cooler temperatures rather than warmer. Is that correct, or is it off? Or is it the types?
So that's a really also very fascinating question. So this global map, which is still taken away here,
I'll leave.
You might see that if you can see the concentrations in the ocean, the bright green colors, you're seeing the seasonal pulse. But the bright green colors tend to be up at the higher latitudes, right? There's more of these plankton in the water where we live than there are in the tropics. If you go to the Caribbean, the ocean looks super clear, right? It's beautiful. You can see down into the coral reef. That's because there's hardly any plankton in the water. In our waters, the waters, when you go out on a sailboat or whatever, you look over the side, they almost look dark and green, right? That's not the water, that's the plankton. This rich water around where we live is different color because of the plankton. They have these pigments, just like, those squash leaves, and it makes the water look green because there's so many of them in the water. And that translates directly into lots of productivity all the way up the food chain. That's why some of the most valuable fisheries in the U.S. are off the Northeast. We're not fishing in the Caribbean, maybe we do get fish from the Caribbean, but the big fisheries have historically been in higher latitudes. The water's colder here, but it's not directly the cold that's leading to the higher productivity. It's actually the fact that the cold is associated with nutrients in the water. Maybe I'm going on too long. You want to pull me off the stage, but on land, you think about, in my raised beds, the most important thing for my plants is that really rich soil that's filled with nutrients. I put compost in there, and that's what provides the nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients that the plants in my garden need to grow. The same thing happens in the ocean, but the degraded matter like you have in the forest floor where you get this nice rich soil, that in the ocean, that's happening in deep water. And when the deep water comes up near the surface, it's bringing those nutrients up and fertilizing the ocean. And the deep water tends to be cold. So places where you have like lots of exchange with the deep ocean bring up nutrients and sort of, let's say, fertilize the surface ocean, and you get lots of productivity. So, long answer, sorry.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Christina, you up?
I think I'm up. I find all this fascinating. So I attribute my love for the ocean to my childhood. And I had the wonderful experience of going to school in Brewster, in my elementary stages, and going out to the Brewster Flats and studying the ecosystems and eating sea pickles and things of that sort. But I'm curious to know your take on how schools are addressing science now in the classrooms, and if you see a lot of those young scientists coming up, if they still have the same hunger, how things have changed over the years, if it's better or if it's worse.
Wow, that's a. I'm not pessimistic if that's where you were kind of leading with the question. I think that we're on a good trend in general in terms of trying to raise the bar and bringing science into schools, and I think the Cape kind of leads the way in some respects on that. The schools in Falmouth have a very strong science, like nationally recognized, science teachers in the town, and I mean, thinking of the experiences of my own children who are 20-somethings at this point, I feel like their generation is more attuned to the importance of science to our lives and livelihoods than perhaps earlier. I'm interested to hear what other folks think about that. I'm no expert.
Heidi, I have
Yes.
one more question for you, and then I think we have to make our way to the next part here. Obviously, you bring a lot of skill and experience to your role. You could do this work pretty much anywhere you chose, I think. Why Cape Cod?
Oh, well, so, maybe I could, but I would. There's no doubt in my mind that the trajectory of my career would have been completely different and not nearly as productive if I had not been here. And I hope that my talk gave some sense of why I feel that way. I love living in a small town. Most of the and in communities like this, I love having raised a family here. And being able to have that part of my lifestyle at the same time that I have a world-class professional place to work like the Oceanographic Institution and the incredible people that make up that institution, that I don't think there's anywhere else that can be reproduced. And that's why I'm here, 25 years later and having no plans to go anywhere else. It's the Oceanographic Institution is recognized around the world for its impact in ocean science, and I count my lucky stars every day that I get to go to work there. It's an amazing place.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Heidi, for sharing your journey that brought you here to the Cape and the success that you've been able to find here. And obviously your passion for what you do and your passion for the Cape was well displayed today. Thank you again. Let's another round of applause. At this time, we do have a little bit of a break. So we invite you all to please make your way to the Vendor Connect. Connect with each other, connect with the vendors, obviously. The next session starts at 1:45, and it will be back in the main ballroom, okay? Thank you.